Our second reading comes from the Gospel of Luke. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face was changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent in those days, and no one said any of those things that they had seen. The word of the Lord. Well, I'm grateful on this Feast of the Epiphany to be able to share a sermon with you. It's been an interesting time to be at Westminster, to be in lockdown, to do virtual worship with you all, but I'm so grateful for the time I've gotten to spend with you, and especially the time with the choir. So this Feast of the Transfiguration, it's got to be one of the more bizarre stories in the Gospels. Jesus goes to a mountain to pray, and that's not unusual. We know Jesus often went to quiet, desolate places to spend time with God, to be away from the masses. But Jesus asks 3 of his closest disciples, Peter, James, and John, to come along with him. And it's hard to think about that and not think of the other time Jesus tells his disciples to come with him to pray, which is on another mountain, the Mount of Olives, right before his passion, right before he enters into Jerusalem for his death. And just like in that case, the disciples are struggling to stay awake. They're falling asleep, their eyes are weighed down, but fortunately, they do see what happens on this mountain, the Mount of Transfiguration. Before their very eyes, the division between the heavenly and the earthly is broken down. Jesus' face, it changes, and his clothes become dazzling white. And on one side, there is Moses, the great lawgiver, and on the other, there is Elijah, the great prophet. These are 2 pillars of the Hebrew faith. The most obvious reason this story is in the Gospel of Luke is to show us that Jesus is in complete continuity with the figures of the Hebrew faith. But it's not just that. It's also that Jesus is the culmination, the fulfillment of both the law and the prophets. But of course, there's still a deeper meaning, a second narrative going on, and we have to reflect on both the mission and stories of Moses and Elijah to get to that. Both of these men, Moses and Elijah, have these experiences of meeting God on a mountain. That's a theme throughout Scripture. God's holy mountain, Mount Zion. And you remember Moses, probably best of all, going on Mount Sinai for time so long that the people wondered if he was dead. And he asked to see God one time. And God says, "If you see me, you cannot live." So God hides Moses in the cleft of the rock. You might remember that from a wonderful hymn. "He hideth my soul in the cleft of the rock." And God's glory, God's goodness passes by. And then if we reflect on Judy's reading from 2 Corinthians, it talks about Moses' face being shining, being sort of glowing, and that it was so much that the people of Israel were afraid of it, that he had to put a veil in front of his face. And that wasn't from seeing God, that was just from talking to God, from being in the presence of God on the holy mountain. And then, of course, there's Elijah, the great prophet. Most memorably, we have the confrontation, the big showdown between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. When he is vindicated, fire comes down from heaven, burns up the offering. But after that, we find Elijah fleeing for his life. We find him seeking safety, searching for God. And he goes to the same holy mountain. It's called Mount Horeb in the story with Elijah, but scholars agree that Mount Horeb and Mount Sinai are names for the same holy mountain. So Elijah knows he's going to a place where God has made himself known in the past. And before God sends Elijah back down the mountain into his vocation, God chooses to make another appearance on this holy mountain. There's a great wind, but God is not in the wind. There's a great earthquake. Stones are broken, and God is not in the earthquake. And finally, there's a great fire, and God is not in the fire. And what follows is a sheer silence. And at that silence, Elijah takes his cloak and he covers his head because the holiness of God, the presence of God is in that silence. Now, as Christians, we can't read both of these stories and see them leading inexorably to the person of Jesus. Now, in this season, through January and February, we've been learning about who Jesus is, from his birth to his baptism to his first miracle at the wedding in Cana. And there are questions that the people have about who this Jesus is. Is he a prophet? Is he like Elijah? Is he going to show how foolish the Roman religions are? Or is he like Moses? Is he a deliverer who will bring the people out from under foreign oppression? And so here it is. Here is Jesus' mountaintop experience to meet with God. And of course, he doesn't so much meet with God as Moses and Elijah come and meet with him. And there's another thing that's so unlike these other mountaintop meetings, which is that there is not this terror, at least not initially. The disciples, Peter, James, and John, they look upon Jesus' face, this changed face, this shining garment, and they can look straight at it. They are privy to the full revelation of the physical and the spiritual made manifest together. Now, I find that often as Western Protestants, this idea of the spiritual and the physical being a single unit often is a problem for us. We often have the sort of modernist thought that the spiritual is fine. It's a matter of the heart. It's a private affair. But there's a clear place where the spiritual ends and the physical, the empirical, the reasonable begins. In fact, sometimes this has led us to the idea that all of Christianity is just about souls and not about bodies, not about whole humans. The Transfiguration is the antithesis to that idea because it shows that the separation between God and humanity, the separation between the physical and from the spiritual, is something that we have invented on our own. I want to go back to the 2 Corinthians passage that Judy read. Towards the end of it, it says, And all of us, with unveiled faces, seeing the glory of the Lord as though reflected in a mirror, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. Now I ask you to take out your bulletins and look at the first hymn. It says, "O wondrous sight, O vision fair of glory that the church shall share, which Christ upon the mountain shows, where brighter than the sun he glows." See that line? Of glory that the church shall share. The glory of God on the mountain, the glory of Jesus on the mountain is not just God's glory or Christ's glory. It is something that we are partakers in. We share in it. It's a sort of irony that sometimes we can focus so much on the things that Jesus did for us, the incarnation, the death and resurrection, that we miss the person of Jesus himself. So to focus on what God did for us and not what God became, and what we are to become as well. I want to look at the final hymn as well. It says, "Sing of God made manifest in a child robust and blessed." This goes verse by verse through these manifestations of Jesus as we've been reading through January and February, this season of Epiphany. Fourth verse, you can see we get to the cloud-capped mountain, the Transfiguration event. And this is a very good hymn, but it's actually a reworking of a slightly older hymn, which is Songs of Thankfulness and Praise. And Charlotte's nodding her head, of course, our local church music expert. And in Songs of Thankfulness and Praise, every verse ends with the simple refrain, "God in man made manifest." Now, if you keep saying that over and over, the trouble is these days is that it sounds quite exclusionary on gender, and that's a problem. So this is actually a very excellent reworking of the hymn, but you do miss this idea of God manifested in humanity. That doesn't quite show up in this hymn. But here's the thing, the manifestation of God in humanity is not just that. It is also the manifestation of humanity in divinity. It's humanity fully realized, reconciled, made more alive than humanity knew it could be, as we are made one with Jesus. This is what the gospel teaches. This is so much of what salvation is about, is the full realization of human beings. Not just sort of transaction of something God did for us, but it's unity, it's humans becoming more truly alive. We're not seeking to lose our bodies and live ethereally. We are seeking to become more truly human, as Jesus himself was human. Now, we can think of this, and we should think of this in universal terms, but we should also think of it in individual terms. What does salvation mean for each one of us? What does salvation mean for Walter? For Walter, salvation means Walter becoming more truly Walter. More Walterness is divinity made manifest in him. We can say the same for each one of us. And so that's why we talk about salvation not so much as an event, but as a process. It's growing into the image of Christ. And the image of Christ is not just the image of God, but it's an image of a realized humanity. Once more, I turn to the reading from 2 Corinthians. It says, "We gaze with unveiled faces on the light of the gospel in the face of Jesus Christ. And when we do that, we are changed from glory to glory. It's this process. It's the thing that we are a part of. It is salvation being made manifest in us. And this is a high point that we are given at the end of this season. Because on Wednesday, we enter into the season of Lent. We have to come down from the mountaintop into the valley, into 40 days of fasting, of emptiness. But we are given this mountaintop experience so that we have a vision of what we are and what we are to become. As we transition, I invite you to take out your bulletins and turn to the response hymn. Take, O take me as I am. We've been using this as a refrain throughout this Epiphany season, which sadly we were largely not in person for. But this little refrain says, take, O take me as I am, summon out what I shall be, set your seal upon my heart and live in me. And as I move to the piano, I want us to think about that phrase, summon out what I shall be. The human potential made manifest in Christ through humanity.
Take